Simon St. Laurent, Senior Editor at O'Reilly. I'm here with Eric Meyer, who's working on a new edition of CSS, the Definitive Guide. He's been on the CSS path for over a decade. He's seen change after change, and this edition seems to be as much change or more change than we've seen in the past. How's the ecosystem growing?
Enormously, explosively, hugely. Other adjectives which denote lots and lots of movement. For those who have been following along with the various editions, you might remember that the first edition to the second edition was kind of a huge jump. There was a lot that got added. And then the second edition to the third edition was sort of a station keeping kind of deal where it was, really not that much has changed. Maybe there have been a few clarifications, browsers refined what they did, and I'm going to drop most of the Netscape 4 warnings, right? Because between the second and third edition was pretty much the middle of the 2000s when not that much was changing, not much was happening. What browsers were doing was they were improving their CSS support at that time. So anyway, the point being that first edition to second edition was this big jump, and then second edition to third edition was sort of a refinement, reflecting what was going on at the time. Well, so third edition to fourth edition is going to be this enormous jump again because there's so much happening now. Even if I tried to go through the list of everything that's changed, I would forget something inevitably. That's how much is going on. So I'm for various reasons, I'm hoping to manage to keep the growth of the book to 50% or less. I don't want to double it in size because that would lead us to another 1,000-page tome, and those can be useful, but it's still a huge brick to have on your shelf or your desk or whatever. And so I'm hoping not to go there, but there's just so much that's happening that sometimes I fear that we're going to end up in that range. And so we'll see. But with advanced layout coming in the next few months, as we record this, all the stuff that's happened with animations and transitions and transforms and figuring out how to even make those examples in a book so that they make any sense at all. There's a font. The font chapter is going to be much bigger than it was, probably, or at least notably bigger than it was, because when I wrote the third edition, there's all this text in the intro about how users have the fonts that they have, and you can't give them a font to display. Well, not true now, right? Web fonts are here. They arrived between the last edition and this edition, and so I can't just ignore those, right? Nor would I want to. And so going through all of that and going through the new font properties that are being discussed, and that by itself is going to take us from what was probably a 30 or 40 page chapter to a 50 or 60 page chapter. Mm-hmm. And that's just an area where something we already had is expanded. That doesn't even count all the new stuff that goes on top of it, on top of what was there before. So it's going to be really enormous, and that's why actually one of the reasons why we're publishing it serially, so that each chapter, as it's done, comes out as its own standalone pre-book. You can get it either electronically or print on demand, and so that way, we're not all sitting around waiting until the end of 2013 when finally, the entire thing is written. It's like, okay, this part's done. Here, have this if you want.
So will it be done by the end of 2013?
We live in hope.
We live in hope.
We live in hope.
Well, how can developers figure out, which parts are real today? It seems like there's a fairly large set of things that are specified but not yet implemented, or implemented differently across browsers, and otherwise made exciting.
Yeah, it's challenging, and a lot of it has to do with, as always, but this is to some degree even more acute now, what your particular project scope is. So if you're doing something that's only ever going to be displayed on iOS devices, the stuff that's in the specs that's supported by mobile iOS devices is a little bit safer, right? Which is not to say go crazy with the proprietary stuff, because that's never a good idea. But, mobile Safari web, WebKit and mobile WebKit will have different support states for stuff that's in the spec than, for example, Firefox will, or Internet Explorer. So or Opera. Sorry, I don't want to get nasty mail from the Opera guys. Or mobile Opera for that matter. They're all going to be in different places, and so that can affect things. But honestly, what it really comes down to is you can look at sites like caniuse.com or HTML5 please.us. And those are good, right? Those are good to get a sort of a baseline. You might look at something, you might be thinking, hey, I want to use this property, and you go to caniuse.com and it says nobody supports this. Okay, maybe you want to skip that one. But you might find another one that says, okay, these browsers are supporting it right now, and these other browsers are working on it, but it's not here yet. Well, if your project isn't shipping for 6 months, then maybe that's okay. And if it has to ship tomorrow, then you might find a different way to do it. But what makes it more difficult to just say, do this and nothing else is that JavaScript shims often exist to add support for a CSS property that the browsers don't natively support yet, but they will soon. And so, if you're already using a JavaScript framework and your JavaScript framework happens to have a plugin that graphs support for that particular thing that, the particular CSS property you want to use into browsers now, then maybe you can do that, but it's really hard to just say, this, caniuse.com says don't use this, right? You might find out, oh, well, you can use it if you're already running JavaScript, just as long as you don't depend on it, right? Because if JavaScript's not available, then that will break. Right. So don't use something that that's not something you absolutely depend on. But again, progressive enhancement comes in, right? You do the really safe stuff and then add things on top of it that, the classic example having been rounded corners, there was a period where we would do the rounded corner CSS and people using Internet Explorer 7 and, wouldn't see the rounded corners. And did that matter? To me, it never did, right? I never cared if I had rounded corners. If somebody got square corners, it was not going to bother them, right? No user was going to come to your site and say, wait, I was promised rounded corners. I will never do business with you again. Yeah, that doesn't happen. Or if it does, then that's probably somebody that your customer service people will thank you for having driven away anyway. So, it's the same kind of thing. We're still doing progressive enhancement and always will be because it's a fundamental principle.
This kind of brings us to an intersection. It's, the JavaScript side, the CSS side. CSS used to be for designers. JavaScript used to be just for programmers. Both sides have put their chocolate in the other's peanut butter or vice versa. But with CSS3, it seems like there are pieces that are, drawing more interest from programmers in particular, some more from designers. Could you just talk about how the different audiences for the different technologies are playing out?
It's an interesting question. So, there are plenty of people who feel that, well, maybe not plenty. There are a few people who feel that there should be no behavior in CSS whatsoever, which would include things like hover. And that ship sailed a really long time ago. In fact, that ship sailed, came back with cargo, left again, caught fire, and sank. So we're kind of done there. And so, you have things like animations, right, which are now possible with CSS. You don't need JavaScript to describe an animation or a transition. Which, some people say, well, this is just hover on steroids, and this is and other people who say, no, this should have been kept in behavior. And again, I can see the theoretical arguments either way, and it doesn't really matter. This is where we're going to go because this is what authors want, right? They want to be able to do cool fade transitions, and they'd like to be able to do it simply and declaratively, which is what CSS really excels at when it tries, is being able to say something very simply and very declaratively. So, hover color red is a lot easier than the JavaScript that was required to do the on mouse over and on mouse out, and like switching the DOM to change the color to red is just hover color red.
Right.
And now with transitions, it can be, transition 1 second or, something like that. And then so it fades from blue to red over 1 second. It fades back rather than trying to, do it in JavaScript where you have timers and set timeouts. I don't know. I'm not really a programmer.
Right. Well, it seems like the power of declarative usage is CSS's power.
Yeah, I mean that's where pretty much anything that can be made declarative, people are working to make declarative. Another sort of forward ahead looking example would be color lightening and darkening, which is being discussed for the CSS colors module level 4, where you can say, you can specify a color, and then you can say, well, this element should use that color but be 30% lighter, something like that, right? Which CSS frameworks like Less and Sass generally already allow for that sort of thing. They have plugins or mix-ins or extensions or whatever the local terminology is that let you say, in addition to saying my color equals this hex, then my color 2 is my color 1 30% lighter or something like that. So they have these ways of shifting colors around, and so that's being discussed for CSS4 colors, and because it's easy enough to do declaratively, right? So that's actually where, to me, that's one of the basic utilities of frameworks from a spec point of view, is that they let people go and try stuff, right?
Right.
And if it turns out that, wow, it's really easy, someone came up with this really nice syntax to make colors lighter or darker, and tons of people are using it, well, okay, maybe that should be in the spec, right? So it becomes an implementation use case, that the working group can just pave the cow path. So,
right.
I'm a fan of paving cow paths.
Yes,
paving cows.
Paving cow paths works really nicely when you can find them.
True.
There's a general concern, which I think you're addressing to some extent by serializing the book, is just that the world of CSS is growing ever larger. Are there limits to how far this can go? Are there pieces that you wish they would really please add now? And are there things that you're glad they finally got around to after a few different versions?
Advanced layout is kind of the answer to both of those things. The Flexbox and grid layout modules are getting a lot of work. Flexbox is CR? I forgot now. Really close to being done. And browsers are supporting it. Grid layout is getting a lot of work. IE10 already supports a previous draft of the grid layout module, and other browsers are making steps in that direction. I know that WebKit has done some, at least initial implementation of grid layout. I think using a newer draft, but IE10 is going to update itself to use that same draft. And so, we've only needed this for 15 years or more to have like a really strong layout system, because CSS does a lot of things really well, but it has a weak layout system, and what layout system it has mostly been cobbled together from stuff that wasn't meant for layout. Your positioning was supposed to be it, but it had certain
problems,
limitations that designers weren't willing to live with, so they figured out how to use floats. And so the ability to define grid lines and associate elements with those grid lines in the layout is insanely powerful, and it's something that we've been looking for a very long time, and it looks like it's almost here. And I've said this before, so I will admit my record as a prognosticator in this area, not the best, but I do feel optimism here, and I think I'm thinking within the next year or so we'll have at least basic grid layout and Flexbox layout that people can use and be able to do some really great, interesting layout stuff. And then if regions catches on, that's going to just open up a whole new box of wow and possibly ow.
Okay.
Well, you remember what happened when desktop publishing gave people access to a ton of fonts, right?
Yes.
Yeah, we had the ransom note newsletter, basically. And then everyone eventually settled down, right? And some people did really great stuff even then. So I think with crazy layouts and really strong layouts where, some people will decide that their website should look like Wired in the 90s, right? In the way that they just like did the craziest layouts ever. But other people, I think, will do very beautiful, tasteful stuff, and that's always the fun part.
Right. Well, with fonts, on the web, we've been limited for a long time with what we can do. You were talking about that earlier. How much uptake are you seeing of the new ability to get people fonts?
I see it a lot, actually. Particularly blogs, news sites, those, blogs and news sites. So, which is a huge portion of what's on the web, of course. So you're like the Gawker family, or they like to set their headlines, or Ars Technica. They do the same thing. I don't think CNN's doing it yet, although I may have missed a memo. But news sites. I mean, major news sites like CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, etc., tend to be wary of that sort of thing because of the performance hit that it can take on their servers. Right? They don't. If you're doing millions of hits a minute, right? Shoving a font file at everybody's, having everyone download this, however many K font file it is, and they can get pretty big, is probably not acceptable. Maybe you push that out to your content delivery network, maybe you don't, right? They tend to be more wary, but I go to Ars Technica or Kotaku or those sorts of sites, and I'll often see the flash of unfonted text. Where I'll see the headline and then suddenly it'll change and it'll be in a different font. Like, oh, okay. I just downloaded whatever font they were giving me. Fortunately, most people aren't using it for their entire page, but some people are, and that can sometimes be interesting. I'm not doing it myself, but by the time I'm done with this book, I may actually have fiddled with fonts enough that I start using custom fonts on Meyer Web. But yeah, people are using it. I think the interesting thing is that we didn't immediately hit ransom note websites, right? I mean, I'm sure a few people did. But there was always that, everyone, I remember when web fonts started to get big, there were some people saying, I remember desktop publishing in the 80s and we're going to have to go through all that again. I really don't want to go through all that again. We really didn't, at least where I hang out. Maybe I only hang out on tasteful websites. I don't know.
One last thing I wanted to talk about is kind of the interaction of HTML5 with CSS3. When HTML5 was first making headlines, people pointed out that a lot of what the sites showing off HTML5 were doing was really using CSS3. The relationship seems to have stabilized. I think people are getting a sense of what's where and how it works. But how much of the interest do you think is driven by this kind of revival and renewal in the HTML world?
Honestly, very little, I would say, from a CSS point of view. I mean, I think interest in web standards in general, HTML5 owes at least as much, or is owed at least as much as CSS3 or any of the other stuff that's been coming up. But in terms of interest in CSS3, HTML5, I don't think has really had that much effect, except I guess in the way that you pointed out, where lots of people were coming out with these HTML5 demos that were not really in HTML5. Some of them literally weren't in HTML5; they were just CSS3 demos. So in that sense, I suppose that has driven some of the interest, from people who maybe don't pay attention as closely to the various specs and what, HTML5 is responsible for and what CSS3 is responsible for and what JavaScript and the DOM are responsible for and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
People who don't pay as close attention to all that sort of thing, they may have been drawn in. But, for people who are, have been doing this for a while, who are professionals in the field, I think if anything, for them it was, okay, yeah, it's not HTML5 at all, but nice CSS, and that'll be fascinating when more than just you support that. Because that was one of the problems with a lot of those HTML5 demos was that they were CSS3 demos that only that particular browser, company that was pushing out supported whatever it was that they were showing off as CSS3. And sometimes what they were showing off wasn't even CSS3. It was our own special thing that we wrote using CSS-like syntax that is in no module and may never be. Which that's totally their right, and I'm always interested to see browser companies experimenting with that sort of thing, but it does rankle a little bit when they try to claim that it's something it's not. And not just because, they're saying that it's CSS3 when it's not CSS3. I mean, if browser company Q came out with, their own HTML5 demo that was really all about the markup and it had all these elements that they had just made up, that would be annoying too.
Right.
So.
Great. Well, thanks for the update, Eric. I'm sure everyone will be looking forward to the CSS, the definitive guide, and the many pieces coming out that will be parts of it. I can't wait to talk more as CSS keeps growing.
Awesome. Thanks, Simon.